Flash floods. They can happen almost out of nowhere. They strike.
I saw this huge, gigantic wall of water coming towards us.
It's a force that for centuries has devastated families, livelihoods, and entire towns. The danger looms even today.
We probably had two alternatives: stay in the car and die, or get out of the car and die.
Flash floods. They can happen almost anywhere, at any time.
I really don't think it's a question of if, I just think it's a question of when.
The ingredients for a flash flood are simple. Too much water, not enough time. They come with little or no warning. When heavy rain falls more quickly than the ground can absorb it, water gathers tremendous force. The threat can be deceptive. Only a few inches of swiftly moving water can knock a person down. 2 feet of water is enough to wash away a car. At their worst, they ravage entire towns. In the 1990s, flooding caused nearly 1,000 deaths in the United States, more than any other type of natural disaster.
I just find it tragic how many people lose their lives because they underestimate the power of the water. It's very hard to imagine that in less than an hour, a quiet stream can turn into a raging torrent.
Almost a century ago, this quiet stream became a rampage that caused one of the worst flash floods in American history. It's called Willow Creek. Beside its banks live the people of Heppner, Oregon, 160 miles east of Portland. The creek meets with 2 canyons that converge south of Heppner. It helped supply water to the first homesteaders who arrived in the late 1800s. Heppner grew rapidly, and by 1903, the population soared to 1,400. As with many western towns, buildings went up quickly, sometimes with no foundations. That was not the case with Heppner's new courthouse. The impressive structure was a symbol of the region's prosperity. Topped with a majestic clock tower, it was tall enough for the entire town to keep time. One of Heppner's wealthiest citizens, T.W. Ayers, salvaged the cupola from the previous courthouse. He made it the crowning touch of his elegant Victorian home. 2 blocks from the Ayers house was Heppner's post office. It was staffed by Gertrude Crawford and Anna McBride. The 2 young women were inseparable. Gertrude wrote to an acquaintance about her friendship with Anna.
For 2 years and a half to a day we had worked together, and it seemed as though we shared almost every thought. Sisters could not have been nearer than we were in every way but blood.
Anna had just become engaged to a young rancher. As the wedding day approached, he built this homestead for his bride-to-be. Heppner also had its share of confirmed bachelors. Leslie Matlock was best known for his stylish clothes and skill at the gambling table. His friend and fellow bachelor, Bruce Kelly, had a reputation for hard work and quiet ways. But Heppner's promising beginning would be cut short. On June 14, 1903, the lives of these people and all of Heppner would be changed forever. It was late Sunday afternoon. women were clearing away supper dishes, and men were stepping onto porches for cigars. Still dressed in their Sunday clothes, people prepared for their evening activities. Heppner was in the grips of an oppressive heat wave. Most people were headed for evening church services or small indoor gatherings away from the humid air and sun. The heat had given Anna McBride a terrible headache. She decided to leave her friend Gertrude's hillside house and spend the evening at her family's home near Willow Creek.
The last thing as Anna left the house, we were laughing and joking as we always were. My home is on the hillside on the opposite side of town, and for the first time in months, Anna and I were not together.
As the hands on the courthouse clock neared 5, a roll of thunder rippled through the valley. Thick clouds were gathering south of Heppner. Most townsfolk welcomed the rain. The thunderstorm would bring relief from the heat and give their parched wheat and alfalfa fields some badly needed water. Leslie Matlock figured he'd wait out the storm at a favorite saloon. But as the thunder got worse, he became concerned. He decided to check on the approaching thundercloud from a nearby hill that offered a good view of town. As he got to the top, he met his friend, Bruce Kelly, who was also keeping an eye on the weather. From the hillside, the men witnessed a cloudburst unlike any storm they had ever seen. Sheets of rain came spilling into the canyon south of Heppner. The dry, rocky soil of the surrounding hills could not absorb all the rainfall. Steep canyon walls channeled the water directly into Willow Creek. The rain, pouring down over 10 square miles, was being funneled straight toward Heppner. A perfect recipe for a flash flood. The water swept up everything in its path: chicken coops, barbed wire, and livestock, hurling them down the valley like battering rams.
All that water and all that material then ran into the Krug Laundry, a steam laundry that was built across the creek at the south end of Heppner. The material built up behind the laundry, effectively damming the water and allowing it to build up.
By the time the building gave way, the water and wreckage was 20 feet high. From their hillside, Matlock and Kelly watched in terror. They knew they were helpless to save Heppner, but there were other towns in the valley below, and the men leapt into action. Even as the water bore down on their hometown, they took to their horses and spurred them over the hillsides. If they could ride fast enough, perhaps they could warn the people of nearby Lexington and Ione. Matlock later described the sight as they rode away from Heppner. I looked back once and saw the water lick up some galloping horses like a cat takes a mouse. It rose and it rose till we thought there wasn't any end to it. It appeared that Heppner's fate was sealed, but 2 towns still lay in the water's deadly path. The riders urged their horses onward, the flash flood close on their heels. On the stormy evening of July 14th, 1903, 2 men made their escape moments before a flash flood tore through their hometown of Heppner, Oregon. The riders, Leslie Matlock and Bruce Kelly, drove their horses across the hills in a desperate ride to save the towns of Lexington and Ione further down the valley. For Lexington, it was too late. By the time they got there, the floodwaters had already ravaged the town. Matlock and Kelly rode on, shouting to every isolated farmhouse they passed, "Get to high ground, head for the hills." Tiny lanterns lit the hillsides as ranchers and their families fled from their homes. Only then did Matlock and Kelly know their warnings had been heard.
It was ironic, perhaps, that the very geologic structure that forced this flow of water to be so destructive, that funneled it and hemmed it in, also provided the only means of escape people had, as they went up.
When the weary riders reached Ione, they felt a rush of relief. They had beaten the flood. They split up and raced through the streets shouting the alarm. As a result, the town's 250 residents made it to the safety of the hills. The waters rolled through the empty streets as Matlock and Kelly rested in the hills above Ione. For the first time that night, fear seized them as they began to imagine what had happened to the people of their own town. At dawn, Matlock and Kelly rode back into Heppner. They were stunned by what they saw. The new clock tower had stopped at the height of the storm, its hands frozen at 5:16 p.m. The destruction of Heppner had taken less than 1 hour. The stately landmark now stood as an eerie testament to nature's wrath. As Matlock and Kelly walked through the town, they saw uprooted trees and shattered houses piled several stories high. Buildings without foundations had been tossed into the raging torrent. The lavish homes that once lined Willow Creek were crushed. T.W. Ayer's once stately home now lay amid the rubble. As the floodwaters hit, the family had climbed higher and higher, finally clinging to the cupola as the house floated through the flooded street. The Victorian ornament had saved their lives. Damage to the Ayer's estate was staggering. When asked about his lost fortune, Ayer said he considered himself lucky, and he was. That morning, the search for the dead was already underway. Using long poles, work teams probed the debris, waiting to feel the dull thump that might have been their friend or neighbor. Many victims still wore the tattered remains of their Sunday best.
It's very important to remember that people do not drown in flash floods, that they're much more likely to be bashed on the head by something or even have their limbs torn from them.
Anna McBride's body was soon found. Anna, her parents, and 3 of her siblings died in their home. Anna's clothing had been torn to shreds, but she still wore this gold ring. Her fiancé had survived the flood. The house he had built for her was intact. Willow Creek rambled quietly nearby. Anna's best friend, Gertrude Crawford, was devastated. She wrote a letter to Anna's relatives in Canada, explaining why she had not gone to pay her last respects.
I hope you will not think hard of me, but I did not see my darling friend. Others tell me she looked so sweet and very natural, scarcely bruised is all. But I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I wanted to always remember her as I saw her last, looking back, laughing, and saying goodbye.
Over the coming days, the road to the cemetery was lined with mourners. Headstones shared a common date, June 14th, 1903. Even as Heppner buried its dead, the death toll grew. The number of bodies recovered would eventually reach 247. Some victims were seen floating in the Columbia River 45 miles away. Nearly 1/5 of the population of Heppner had been killed in the flood. Every single survivor mourned the loss of a loved one. News of the disaster brought relief workers from across Oregon. Money and supplies poured in from around the Pacific Northwest. Hundreds of volunteers were housed in makeshift camps like this one. For the townspeople, there was never any question of leaving Heppner behind.
They had plans, they had dreams, they had ties now to the land. They'd invested their own lives and their children's futures here. This was their land. They were farmers, they were ranchers, they belonged here. They stayed.
The town of Ione awarded Bruce Kelly and Leslie Matlock gold canes for their bravery. True to his quiet nature, Bruce Kelly lived the rest of his life at his ranch and rarely discussed the flood. Leslie Matlock, on the other hand, frequently recounted the tale of their wild ride. For the rest of his life, Matlock was never seen in town without his beautiful cane. But his bravado hid a deep sadness. Toward the end of his life, Matlock confided in an acquaintance that he still wondered what might have happened had he stayed behind to help the people in Heppner instead of making his heroic ride. He added that ever since that day, he would often wake up from a nightmare that he was drowning. Today, Heppner, Oregon is not much bigger than it was in 1903. There has never been a repeat of the terror of that June night. Many residents are confident that a dam built in 1982 will protect them in the years to come. Others think the next flash flood is simply a matter of time.
It's very easy to underestimate the stream that you lived by all your life. And it's very hard to imagine that this quiet stream could become a 30-foot deep, raging river. I really don't think it's a question of if, I just think it's a question of when.
For residents of Colorado's Big Thompson Canyon, that when came on July 31st, 1976. July 31st, 1976, Colorado's centennial anniversary weekend. The state filled with vacationers ready to enjoy the festivities. A popular destination that weekend was the Big Thompson Canyon. 40 miles north of Denver, the beautiful Big Thompson River and spectacular surrounding terrain drew thousands of visitors. Teenagers Tim Bean and John Wood had spent a year planning their cycling trip through the mountains. They pitched their tent beside the river at a campground called Seven Pines.
It was a fantastic trip for us to be away from family, on our own, going out to have a great adventure riding our bikes in the Rocky Mountains. We'd seen pictures of the Rocky Mountains, but we'd never seen mountains before.
A few miles downriver from Seven Pines stood an A-frame cabin. It was a weekend sanctuary for Deborah Watts and her family. Deborah and her husband Gary had made many trips to the cabin with their children, 7-year-old Cindy and 3-year-old Aaron. This weekend was the first time they brought their 3-week-old son, Sean.
It was just a very soothing, a very comforting thing just to be up there and be near that river and wake up in the morning and just hear the sound of that river.
Several miles further downriver was the Sylvandale Ranch. That weekend, the ranch was hosting a group of women on a religious retreat organized by Marilyn Henderson.
I remember as we drove up the canyon thinking that we'd really hit, we'd hit great weather, and we're looking forward to being together.
By evening, the canyon was filled with over 2,000 visitors, as well as another 600 year-round residents. The steep rock walls echoed with the sounds of the Big Thompson River as it rambled under bridges and past quaint cottages. Few were concerned by the towering thunderhead rising near the western edge of the canyon. Scattered showers began to fall.
The clouds began to roll in, which was pretty typical of the Big Thompson area. Usually in the afternoons we'd have our spring showers. So that wasn't anything really unusual at all.
It rained heavily at Seven Pines. Tim Bean and John Wood abandoned their soggy tent and took refuge in their car.
It was raining, and so we just reclined our seats back as far as they would go, and we just started to snooze to wait the rain out.
The thunderhead now loomed above the Big Thompson River. The winds that normally push storm systems quickly over the mountains were unusually calm. The huge dark clouds stalled directly over the canyon. Around 7 o'clock, Noel Elfering and his family were making their way up the canyon road along the river.
We couldn't see to drive. It was hailing and raining so hard, so we pulled into 7 Pines.
The Elferings' vehicle drew more than a few stairs as it pulled into the campground. It was a school bus that had been converted to a camper, repainted, and named the Jolly Green Giant. The Elferings backed into their spot by the river, grateful to be off the road on such a stormy night. Yet the roar of the river was frightening the family.
I opened the back door and looked out, and I said, nothing to worry about. It's got to come up 30 or 40 feet. So I walked from the back of the bus to the front of the bus, and I don't think it took me a minute and a half at the most. It's 65 feet long. And I sat down in the driver's seat, and I turned on the headlights, and I couldn't believe what I saw.
In the time it had taken Noel to walk the length of his bus, the river had jumped its banks and surrounded the camper. A river, a canyon, and a thunderstorm had combined to unleash a flash flood. Waiting in their car, Tim and John were having trouble sleeping.
As we were laying there, the sound changed around us. And, you get used to the constant babbling of the river in front of you, and all of a sudden it wasn't there anymore. We rolled down our windows, and the water was halfway up the door.
John turned the key. Somehow, the engine started, and the 2 young men raced out of their campsite. In any flash flood, the safest place is high ground. But to the frightened campers, the canyon walls seemed anything but safe. The water pouring off the hillsides looked like another torrent to fight. Tim and John decided to escape in their car and drive out of the canyon.
We got about halfway to the road, to the exit out of the campground, and our car died. It had drowned out.
A few campsites away, Noel Elfering quietly slipped into the driver's seat of the bus. Without a word to his family, he gently turned the key in the ignition.
I started my motor, and I could hear the fan and water. And I knew if I stepped on the gas very hard, it would suck that water over the motor and drown it out. So I put it in low, and just crawled up. And then when I came up to the road, I kept 2 wheels on the high side off the road up against the guardrail.
Up and down the river, people were heading to bed, unaware that the canyon was quickly becoming a death trap. As the river crept closer to Noel's bus, the worst natural disaster in Colorado history had begun. The night of July 31st, 1976, a pounding rain was falling on Colorado's Big Thompson Canyon. The canyon walls worked like a giant funnel, channeling the downpour directly into the Big Thompson River. The result? Flash flood. Noel Elfering drove his family from their riverside campsite at 7 Pines and moved their camper to higher ground. Within minutes, everything below them was surrounded by water. To the other campers, the converted school bus looked like the nearest refuge from the storm.
We were up a little higher, and at that point we were safe, so we just told them to come on in. And so one by one they did.
And that's the way it was all night. We kept pulling people in.
George and Peggy Coyle, along with their basset hound Clyde, were among the campers who waded through the shoulder-high water and finally arrived at Noel's doorstep.
We said, we have our dog with us. And he said, well, we've got 23 people in here now. And but he let us bring Clyde in.
As people came in, they were soaking wet. So we gave them dry clothes.
If it was a man, he got my clothes, regardless whether it fit or not. If it was a woman, they got my wife's clothes. If it was a kid, we got the closest kid to whatever age they were. My wife has a good supply of clothes when we go on vacation.
Now, with 25 people and 1 dog aboard, the Elferings hoped the water would subside. Tim Bean and John Wood were still trapped in the campground. They climbed out of their stalled car, but before they could get to higher ground, the flood swept them away. The only object within their reach was a small pine tree.
I took the needles and just gathered them up in my hand and twisted them around my hand until I could get up and grab hold of a branch, and then slowly, hand over hand, brought myself into the tree.
John grabbed another branch and climbed up behind Tim. The 2 young men clung to the trunk of the small tree as the floodwaters swept below them.
The flood of the Big Thompson River was not so much rising water as it was surging water. The water would surge in waves coming down the canyon.
The many bridges that crisscrossed the river intensified the flood's destruction. They trapped water and debris, causing the flood to rise higher and higher. When the dam finally collapsed, everything downstream was hit with renewed force. Areas already flooded met with a devastating blow. Further down the canyon, these walls of water had flooded the cabin of Gary and Deborah Watts. The couple had seen flash floods before. They knew they had to gather their 3 children and scramble up the canyon wall outside.
We're running around trying to get children together and jackets on. The water just began to totally inundate the house.
Rising floodwaters and debris blocked the doors to the cabin. Deborah tried to smash open a bedroom window to escape.
When I turned back around in that bedroom area, I remember looking down at my arm, and I realized that I had almost completely cut my arm off.
Deborah's nearly severed arm made it impossible for her to help the children through the tiny bedroom window. The family rushed into the upstairs loft of the cabin. It was their only escape from the rising water.
I remember little Aaron was just sitting there and just rocking and rocking back and forth. And then I remember him covering his ears because by that time, the roar of the river was just incredible.
For some, the only warning of the flood came from the few police officers on duty that night. Patrolmen had noticed the rising river and began going door to door, warning people about the impending flood. Just before 10 o'clock, that warning came to Marilyn Henderson, her friend Melanie Alquist, and 33 other women on retreat at the Sylvandale Ranch, located a few miles outside the canyon.
Over loudspeakers, we heard voices say, "Evacuate immediately. There's a flash flood coming. Don't take anything with you, just grab your purses and run."
It was barely raining there, but the women heeded the warning. Marilyn and Melanie joined 3 other women from the retreat and sped away from the ranch. Within moments, the rain began falling in sheets over the car. The women pulled into a parking lot where a few police officers were instructing frightened campers. Most officers advised people to climb the hillsides. One patrolman, however, gave Marilyn deadly advice.
He wanted us to evacuate and go down the canyon, heading toward Loveland. So there was no one game plan, I guess, for everyone.
It was shortly after that we came to a bridge. And we could see that the car in front of us, directly in front of us, was going through some water. You could see the water on the bridge. We slowed down, but when we got to the bridge, a wave of water literally came up over the bridge and hit us broadside. You could not imagine the feeling of your car just lifting right up off the road.
Their car was now a part of the torrent of water and debris that was rushing out of the canyon.
There was a mobile home coming right alongside of our car. There were parts of trees. There were propane gas tanks. At that point, we probably had two alternatives: stay in the car and die, or get out of the car and die.
Melanie and I both, being in the front seat, rolled down the windows. We sat on the windowsill, and I remember, all I remember is looking at Melanie over the top of the car.
And as soon as I had any part of my body in the water, the force of the water ripped my body pretty much out the rest of the way out the window and into the river. I felt like a bullet. You are going so fast, and I was spinning around. And the only thing you're aware of, that I was aware of, was this force, this incredible force, carrying me very fast.
Several miles upstream, Deborah Watts, her husband Gary, and their 3 children were trapped in the loft of their cabin. Deborah had lost a great deal of blood from the deep cut on her arm. Suddenly, another wave of water surged down the canyon.
I remember looking up to the peak of the cabin, and the rafters and the beams that held the house up just started kind of twisting like this, just like pretzels, just right over our heads.
The roof of the cabin collapsed. Deborah could see her son Aaron within her grasp. She reached out for him.
I had lost so much blood, and actually the use of my arm, and I'm trying to reach my arm out, and my little 3.5-year-old is reaching towards me with his hand, and I just wasn't able to grab his hand and pull him into my arms. And he was washed on down the river.
The flood continued to rage. For thousands of people still in the canyon, the terror was far from over. On July 31st, 1976, the Big Thompson Canyon in north-central Colorado saw nearly a year's worth of rainfall in one night, 12 inches in 4 hours. The water that poured into the Big Thompson River created a deadly flash flood. The river rose 20 feet within the narrow canyon. 233,000 gallons of water per second thundered through the rock walls, sweeping away everything in its wake. The Watts family cabin sat directly in the flood's path. Deborah had nearly severed her arm trying to escape through a window. Weak from blood loss, she was unable to save her 3-year-old son, Aaron, as the cabin collapsed.
The next thing that I remember is seeing my husband coming towards me, and he had the baby under his T-shirt, but in his arms. So I knew that they were still alive.
A few seconds later, Gary and Deborah heard the cries of their 7-year-old daughter, Cindy. Cindy's windbreaker had snagged on a tree branch and saved her from drowning. Deborah knew their only hope was to get to high ground, but in her weakened state, she knew she could never make the climb.
So I told Gary, I said, take the kids and go as high as you possibly can, and I'll be okay. I ended up crawling up the mountainside, and I would imagine at least halfway up the mountainside is the clump of trees that I ended up straddling for the rest of the night.
Deborah held on to a tree trunk and waited. She had no idea how long she had been there when she spotted an RV across the river. The campers were using a searchlight to monitor the flood below. Suddenly, their light fell on Deborah.
They would stop that light on me, and they would just hold that light on me for a while. And of course, I knew, that they knew that I was still there and that I was still alive.
A few miles east, Melanie Ahlquist and Marilyn Henderson were now a part of the thundering river. They had been ripped from their car, carrying 3 other women, and hurled downstream. They had survived the torrent for almost a mile as trees, boulders, and cars crashed around them. Then, suddenly, they felt the river slow down. The river passed a low-lying area. As the water poured in, it created a pool of slower-moving water. Melanie and Marilyn had been tossed into that pool.
I was so surprised. I just stopped, and I was able to get my bearings. And a few feet away from that calm spot, there was a tree. I got over to the tree, and so I grabbed onto the bark of the tree.
Debris from the flood began to pile against the trunk. Melanie used it like a stepladder. She climbed higher and higher until she was safely out of the water, perched in the branches of this tree. A few yards away, Marilyn caught hold of a different tree.
As the river washed me into this tree, and I could stand with one foot and hold on.
Each of the 2 survivors was unaware that the other was still alive. They clung to those trees for several hours.
And I just remember saying a very simple prayer: God, you need to send some help or take me home because I can't hold on any longer.
At that moment, Clifford Moore, a local rancher, was driving down the nearby highway. Marilyn caught sight of his headlights.
I remember yelling. It's absurd, but because I had just said sort of the childlike prayer, Lord, send some help, I yelled, here I am, as if they were looking for me.
The rancher couldn't swim, yet he tied a rope around his waist and waded into the water.
And got to me and picked me up in his arms, big, strong Colorado rancher, and carried me out to the bank.
Moore took Marilyn to his nearby home. She told him there had been others in her car, that they might still be in the water. Immediately, Moore headed back to the river. But when he saw Melanie Ahlquist, he knew that the deeper and faster water around her meant that he would need help.
I just saw the figure of a man, and I started yelling for help. And he heard me, and he yelled back, I'll get help.
For nearly 4 hours, Noel Elfering and his family had been watching the river rise and fall outside their converted school bus. 19 others had taken shelter inside Noel's camper. Through the driving rain, Noel could see 2 teenagers trapped in a pine tree across the river. He was determined to rescue them, but that meant crossing the torrent.
The water came up extremely fast. I would say a minute and a half, the water could come up 30 feet high, and then it could go back down just as quick.
Noel kept his eye on the boys and waited for the river to go down one more time. High in the pine tree, Tim Bean and John Wood bore the wrath of the storm.
The rain was so heavy on us, and flashes of lightning all around us, tremendous noise. The river just roared.
Before the boys realized that the water had dropped, Noel Elfering appeared beneath their tree. Tim Bean was too frightened to move.
He was reluctant to come with me. I think he was afraid that he had drowned yet, But we pulled him back in.
Tim and John joined the rest of the refugees in Noel's eccentric vehicle. Before the night was over, one more person took shelter on the bus, bringing the total number of passengers to 28.
I feel certain we owe our lives to Noel and his Noel's Ark. We renamed it.
Those on Noel's Ark knew the worst was over. They were cold and wet, but alive. Together they waited for dawn. More than 20 miles away, Melanie Ahlquist was sure that no one would brave the water to save her. She didn't know how much longer she could hang on. But rancher Clifford Moore had kept his promise and called for help. 2 search and rescue workers, Paul Baker and Scott Call, were helicoptered to the scene.
I got to this tree here. The water level is about to where this big limb is right here. And Melanie is basically sitting right in that tree. There's a little fork right above there.
I remember Paul looking up and saying, I'm Paul, and this is Scott, and we're going to get you out of here.
And she says, well, my name's Melanie Ahlquist, and I hope you can.
Melanie was rushed to the hospital where she was reunited with Marilyn. Their 3 companions were not as lucky. Their battered bodies were found alongside the river, their car completely destroyed. Halfway up the canyon, Deborah Watts had made it through the night, clinging to the base of a tree. The RV that had spotted her radioed for help. At first light, a helicopter airlifted her family to a waiting hospital. The body of her 3-year-old son, Aaron, would not be found for several weeks. On the morning of August 1st, 1976, 28 people walked out of the big green bus. The road was impassable on both sides. When the helicopters arrived, they had only enough room for children, the sick, or the injured. The helicopters left with half of Noel's passengers. For the remaining people, there was only one way out of the devastated canyon. They would have to climb the mountain and walk 7 miles toward the nearest town, Estes Park. The Coils Basset Hound Clyde led the way, as 14 people made the slow and steady climb. A newspaper photographer snapped this photo as they finally made their way out of the canyon. Noel and his group were among the first to leave the flooded area under their own power.
We got up to Estes Park. I just couldn't believe there was anything so beautiful that things weren't destroyed, because everything was destroyed down there.
The Big Thompson flood killed 139 people and caused over $30 million in damage. Enough time has passed since the catastrophic flood to hide the physical scars on the landscape.
That's where our cabin sat, and of course those are all new trees since the flood was here. There was quite a bit of land that was actually lost, so the river is much, much wider than it used to be.
The canyon is once again a favorite spot for camping trips and summer homes, but the danger of flash floods remains, despite advances in weather forecasting.
We have enhanced technology that brings us real-time stream gauge and rain gauge information that we didn't have any of at the time of the Big Thompson flood. But I think we'll see it again, and the technology doesn't prevent that.
Forecasters still have no way of determining which storm will merely swamp basements and which will create a flash flood powerful enough to level a town. And warnings alone can't save lives. Heavy rainfall and rising water are the danger signs of a flash flood. In just a few moments, cars and buildings can become death traps. The only safety is high ground.
It's still going to mean, even in the 21st century, that people are going to have to heed the environmental cues. And also maybe decide that they'd be better off wet than dead. They'd rather spend the night cold and wet on the hillside, late for dinner, late for their appointments, feel a little stupid, but at least be alive. Because that's the force that a flash flood presents.
You can be absolutely safe enjoying a beautiful day, meandering across a little river, and 6 hours later it can be 30 feet wide and 12 feet high and wipe away people that are most dear to you.
Don't underestimate the power It's a very unforgiving force, and it doesn't choose. It just happens.